Black Waitress helped a lost white CEO dad. She had no idea he'd change her life forever. Subscribe for more stories. Excuse me, your little girl has been standing up on that chair for at least 5 minutes. The sharp voice of a woman at table 4 cut through the cafe's midday buzz. The cozy Portland establishment, known for its cinnamon-spiced lattes and comfortable leather seating, was busier than usual for a Thursday. Behind the counter, 24-year-old Maya Brooks, a composed black woman with kind eyes, paused from arranging a tray of pastries. She looked toward a man in his late 30s, his suit creased and his face etched with deep fatigue. He made a gentle gesture toward the small girl at his side, but she paid him no mind. Her attention was fixed on the window, her small fingers sketching unseen shapes on the glass. Maya moved from behind the counter with a quiet grace. Ignoring the impatient muttering from other tables, she knelt down beside the child. The little girl, who looked to be about 6, was moving her hands in very specific patterns. Maya gently signed. "What would you like to drink?" The girl's head turned with a start, her wide blue eyes locking with Maya's. With slow deliberation, she signed back, "Strawberry milk." The man beside her straightened, a look of pure shock on his face. "Wait, did she just answer you?" Maya offered a soft smile and took a small notepad from her apron. She wrote, "I'm deaf, too." "I understand." His eyes fell to the words she'd written, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "She hasn't responded to anyone in almost a year. Not even to me." Maya gave a knowing nod and signed to the girl again. "I'll get your milk." When she came back with a drink, the child was sitting peacefully, her legs swinging gently as she tapped a quiet rhythm on her thigh. Maya placed the glass before her with a small, cheerful flourish, earning a timid smile in return. The man observed them, his expression a mixture of wonder and heartache. They ate their meal in a comfortable quiet, a grilled cheese for the girl and a black coffee for him. Sophie would occasionally grin at Maya's small, signed jokes, sometimes replying with "thank you" or "funny." When they were preparing to leave, the man hesitated at the counter, as if he'd forgotten something. He jotted a quick message on a napkin and left it beneath his empty cup. A few minutes later, Maya went to clear their table and found the note. She carefully unfolded the paper. "Thank you for making her smile." She held the napkin with a delicate touch, as if the words might disintegrate. A warmth spread through her chest, not just from the message, but from the careful way it was written and the look the little girl had given her. The look of someone who had found a glimmer of light in a vast darkness. She glanced toward the window, but they had already disappeared into the street. Maya slipped the napkin into her apron pocket, not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was the man's exhausted kindness, his rumpled suit, and his weary eyes. Or perhaps it was the little girl, Sophie. She noticed the name stitched onto her backpack, who seemed like a small, quiet mirror of her father. When she smiled, though, it was like witnessing someone take their first full breath after a long time. Back at her post, Maya's movements were a little slower, her thoughts lingering on the occupants of that corner booth. She couldn't have known that the man, Daniel Whitmore, had once built a tech empire from a Seattle garage and commanded boardrooms with an easy confidence. Now he was living in the shadows, running from headlines, from a courtroom, and from the woman who had fractured their family. And his daughter, Sophie, had not uttered a sound since the day her mother had walked out on them. Daniel had no direction, no strategy, only a single, desperate mission: to protect his child. And in that cafe, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he had seen her connect with someone. Maya's apartment, situated above a flower shop on Portland's east side, smelled faintly of lavender and clean laundry. The space was humble but warm, with cheerful yellow walls and handmade curtains that danced in the breeze. A kettle began to sing as she prepared 2 mugs of chamomile tea. Her 16-year-old sister, Jasmine, was on the couch, surrounded by textbooks and fluorescent highlighters, her hearing aids resting on the end table beside her. Like Maya, she was deaf, but her world seemed brighter, less encumbered by the silence. Maya set a mug down for her and signed, "You need to sleep, not cram more history." Jasmine smirked in reply. "You need to worry less." "I'm doing fine." Maya returned the smile, though the lines of fatigue were visible on her face. Juggling cafe shifts, mounting medical bills, and overdue rent felt like a daily tightrope walk. She once had ambitions of becoming a teacher for deaf children, but Jasmine needed her, so she worked on, quiet and unwavering. The following morning, sunlight filled the cafe's windows. Maya moved with an effortless grace between the tables, offering regulars warm smiles and quick, expressive gestures. Her eyes drifted to the entrance, and she froze. They had come back. Daniel and Sophie were standing in the doorway. Sophie, clutching a stuffed fox, scanned the room until her eyes landed on Maya, and her entire face lit up. She signed, a bit awkwardly but with clear intent, "Hello, friend." Maya's own face broke into a wide grin. "Hello, Sophie. I missed you," she signed back. Daniel seemed a little more rested than before, though a preoccupied air still clung to him. They chose their same table, and Maya brought over a strawberry milk without being asked. "Did she just say friend?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with amazement. "She did," Maya confirmed on her notepad, adding a small winking face. "I am impressed and grateful," he said. "I'm Daniel. And I suppose you already know Sophie." Maya nodded and wrote, "Maya, it's nice to meet you properly." Daniel glanced around the cafe before leaning in a bit closer. "I told Sophie we're on vacation," he confessed. "The truth is, I'm taking some time off. Trying to find our footing again." Maya nodded in understanding. Everyone had something they were running from, even if it was never spoken aloud. After their food arrived, Maya went back to her duties, but she found her gaze repeatedly drawn to their table. Sophie was tracing patterns on the window again, but this time, she was smiling more freely. Daniel whispered something that made her giggle. After they had gone, Maya discovered a small, leather-bound notebook left on the table. She opened it with care. The pages were filled with drawings of hand signs, each labeled in pencil. "Hello. Thank you. Milk. Love." On the very first page, a note was scrawled. "Try to learn so I can stop being afraid of the silence." A tightness formed in Maya's chest. He was learning for Sophie, and maybe just a little for her as well. She placed the notebook behind the counter, intending to give it back, but a part of her hoped he would return for it himself. Daniel intrigued her, not as a romantic fantasy, but because of the way he looked at his daughter, as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored. It was a gentle, quiet devotion, but there was also sadness in his posture and a hint of guilt in his eyes. Maya recognized it. She had seen it in her own reflection. She understood the weight of silence and all the things that are left unsaid. That evening, back in her apartment, Jasmine noticed the change in her sister's mood. "You're smiling," she signed with a playful look. "Is it because of the man from the cafe?" Maya rolled her eyes, but a pleasant warmth remained. She took out the napkin Daniel had left, the one that read, "Thank you for making her smile," and placed it next to the notebook. She didn't know who Daniel Whitmore truly was, but she knew this much. He was a father who was trying his best, and Sophie had smiled today. For now, that was more than enough. The motel room was hushed, its quiet broken only by the hum of distant traffic and the creaking of an old radiator. The establishment, wedged between a laundromat and a boarded-up bookstore in East Portland, was modest. Its faded green carpeting and mismatched furniture spoke of a time long past, but Daniel hardly registered his surroundings. He sat on the bed's edge, his gaze fixed on his daughter, who was coloring peacefully on the floor. Sophie was lying on her stomach, colored pencils fanned out around her. Her expression was one of intense focus and calm, but she was silent, always silent. Daniel let out a slow breath and raked a hand through his hair. For 2 years, he had constructed walls around himself and Sophie, desperately trying to protect what little they had left. After a brutal custody battle that had exposed his ex-wife Elena's affairs, deceit, and negligence, he had won and immediately taken Sophie away from Seattle. Yet his victory fell hollow. His daughter was still withdrawn into a world of silence, and he often wondered if she would ever speak again. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. 3 missed calls from his lawyer. Elena was threatening another appeal. She wanted Sophie back, not out of love, but for leverage. For the headlines. Daniel could still hear her voice, a venomous, silken whisper in his memory. You're playing the part of the grieving dad. You have no idea how to raise a child. He glanced at Sophie, who was now gently shading in the sky on her drawing. She was his entire world, and yet he felt like he was failing her at every turn. Later that afternoon, they needed to pick up some groceries, so Daniel took Sophie to a small market on Hawthorne Avenue. He pushed the shopping cart at a slow pace, one hand resting on her shoulder while the other scanned the shelves. He was completely unprepared for the flash of a familiar face in the produce section. It was Maya, her dark hair tied up in a messy bun, a tote bag slung over her shoulder as she considered a bunch of bananas. She looked surprised for a moment, then broke into a warm, unhesitating smile. Sophie's face immediately lit up. She dropped the apple she was holding and ran toward Maya, who caught her in a soft embrace, laughing silently as Sophie signed the word happy. Daniel approached, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his wrinkled shirt and the exhaustion in his eyes. "Hi," he said quietly. Maya signed back a greeting, then scribbled on her ever-present notepad. "We always seem to run into each other where it smells like fruit." Daniel let out a small chuckle. "Sophie is drawn to you," he said. "She doesn't run to very many people." Maya looked down at Sophie and mimed a playful little dance between the apples and oranges. After a moment's hesitation, Daniel asked, "Would you like to walk with us?" "There's a park nearby." Maya nodded her assent. Their walk was quiet but comfortable. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long, soft shadows on the path. Sophie skipped ahead, occasionally turning back to sign butterfly or tree with joyful enthusiasm. When they reached a clearing near a pond, Maya sat with Sophie and began to draw faces in the dirt. Happy, sad, surprised, and encouraged Sophie to copy them. Daniel watched from a short distance, his arms crossed, his heart feeling both heavy and hopeful. After a few minutes, he went over and joined them. Maya handed him a stick. He knelt down awkwardly and etched a small, simple smiley face in the dirt. Sophie giggled. "You see," Maya wrote to Daniel. "Not bad for a beginner." They stayed until the sun began to set, then walked back toward the street. At the edge of the sidewalk, Daniel paused. "You always use your apron to dry your hands," he observed, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, folded square of white linen, beautifully embroidered with the initials MB. "I saw it at a market near the motel," he said softly. "It's a small thing, but I thought, something warm for someone who is always giving warmth to others." Maya ran her fingers over the delicate stitching, her lips slightly parted, at a loss for words. She looked up into his eyes, which seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Sophie tugged on Maya's sleeve and signed the word pretty. Maya signed back, very. At the edge of the parking lot, Daniel hesitated, watching Maya walk away with Sophie waving behind her. Across the street, Maya stopped and turned back one last time. She gracefully signed, "Thank you for today." Daniel stood frozen in that moment, the evening breeze tugging at his coat as the sounds of the city swirled around him. In that profound stillness, he felt the echo of her hands, gentle, meaningful, and full of a hope he hadn't expected to ever feel again. The days soon fell into a comfortable rhythm. Daniel and Sophie would show up at the café in the mid-morning, usually after the initial rush had subsided, when the aroma of fresh baking still hung in the air and sunlight streamed through the large windows. Maya always had a table waiting for them by the window, with a glass of strawberry milk already set out. Sophie no longer clung to her father's side. Instead, she would greet Maya with a wave, her small hands already forming signs, clumsy but full of joy. Each day, Maya would kneel beside her and introduce a new game, naming animals, playing emotion charades, or pairing simple drawings with their corresponding signs. One morning, Sophie proudly signed elephant, curling her arm to mimic a trunk. Maya clapped her hands and signed back funny, with an exaggerated expression, which sent Sophie into a fit of bright, clear laughter that startled some of the other customers. Daniel froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. That laugh. He hadn't heard that sound in years. He watched as Maya let Sophie have the spotlight, her own smile quiet and encouraging. Later that afternoon, while Sophie was coloring in her corner, Daniel lingered by the counter. "She used to laugh like that all the time," he said quietly. "Back when things were different." Maya tilted her head, giving him her full attention. "She stopped talking when her mother left," he continued. "We tried everything, therapy, special schools, but nothing seemed to work. Eventually, we just stopped pushing. I think I was afraid to face how much of her I had already lost." He let out a shaky breath. "They say kids are resilient, but maybe they just get very good at hiding their cracks." Maya didn't write anything down this time. Instead, she simply reached across the counter and gently tapped the back of his hand twice. Her simple, silent way of saying, "I understand." He looked from her fingers back to her face. "What about you?" he asked. She paused to think for a moment, then wrote, "I wanted to be a teacher for deaf kids, but dreams cost money, and my sister needed me more." Daniel read the words slowly. "You'd be amazing at it," he said. Maya blushed and turned away, pretending to straighten the napkin dispenser. That evening, after the cafe had closed for the night, Maya was helping Mara, the kind older woman who owned the shop, with the inventory. Mara let out a sigh as she looked at the electricity bill. "Another late notice," she grumbled. "I swear these companies raise the rates just for the fun of it." Maya didn't reply. She just kept sweeping the floor, staying a little longer to help, just as she always did. She didn't know that Daniel had overheard that brief exchange earlier in the day. The next morning, when Mara opened her email, she found a receipt confirming that the bill had been paid in full. There was no name attached, only a simple note. "Thank you for giving us a place to laugh." Maya found the note taped to the side of the espresso machine. She read it twice before quietly folding it and slipping it into her apron pocket. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were noticeably brighter when Daniel and Sophie arrived that morning. Sophie greeted her with a happy wave and immediately launched into a new sign Maya had taught her the day before. Maya responded with a smile and handed her a small envelope filled with animal flashcards she had drawn herself. Each one was colorful and playful, labeled in both English and sign language. From his booth, Daniel watched them, his coffee completely forgotten. He saw Sophie's newfound ease, her unrestrained joy, and the way she now signed with freedom and confidence. It was like watching the sun rise after a very long and cold winter. And Maya, in turn, found herself watching Daniel too. It wasn't just the way he looked at Sophie, but the way he listened to her, the way he always met her eyes when she signed, and the way he never seemed to rush her silence. Still, a seed of fear lingered. He was kind, but he was also guarded. And she was just a waitress with a hearing aid, a deferred dream, and a tiny apartment above a flower shop. That night, after closing, Maya stood by the window, folding napkins. Outside, the city lights cast a soft glow in the darkness. She held the small, folded note in her fingers again, rereading Daniel's words. She wondered if he knew just how little she had, how much she struggled just to stay afloat. If he knew, would he still come back? She pressed a hand gently over her heart and whispered words she couldn't hear. The storm didn't arrive with thunder and lightning. It came quietly, with a knock on the motel room door and a man in a crisp suit holding a manila envelope. Daniel opened it with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the document before he dropped it to the floor as if it were on fire. It was a subpoena, family court, filed by Elena Whitmore, Sophie's mother. She had found them. That night, Daniel sat on the edge of the motel bed, his phone dark and heavy in his palm. Sophie was sleeping beside him, her breathing soft and even, her arms curled protectively around her stuffed fox. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, a rhythm that did nothing to soothe the ache in his own. Elena, just thinking her name, made his jaw tighten. She hadn't cared when Sophie had stopped speaking. She hadn't stayed a single night at the hospital when Sophie had been sick. She hadn't come back even once after packing her bags and leaving with the man who supposedly understood her art, and now she wanted her daughter back. Armed with a team of lawyers and a collection of polished lies, she was coming to claim the child she had so easily abandoned. Daniel raised the phone to his ear, but hung up before it could ring. He couldn't talk to his lawyer yet. Not until he could figure out what this all meant. The next day, he took Sophie to the café, determined to act as if nothing had changed. Maya was already there, placing small jars of fresh flowers on each table. When she spotted Sophie, she waved and signed, "Welcome, sunshine." Sophie signed back, giggling. Daniel forced a smile, but it felt stiff and unnatural on his face. They sat in their usual booth. Maya brought over a plate of banana bread and their two customary drinks, black coffee and strawberry milk. She could sense that something was wrong. Daniel's hands fidgeted restlessly, and his gaze wouldn't settle. After Sophie had wandered over to the small reading nook, Daniel looked at Maya and spoke in a quiet, strained voice. "She's trying to take her back," he said. "Her mother, Elena." Maya's brow furrowed in concern. She quickly wrote on her notepad, "How?" In clipped, tense words, Daniel explained. "Subpoena, court date, custody challenge." He didn't say Elena's name again. Maya read his every word, a feeling of heaviness growing in her chest. When he was finished, he pulled a small velvet pouch from his coat pocket. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. Maya hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside lay a delicate bracelet made of braided thread, with a single metal charm engraved with the American Sign Language symbol for hope. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "You gave that to us," Daniel said softly, without even meaning to. "Before we met you, Sophie hadn't smiled in months. She wouldn't let me touch her, wouldn't eat without crying. And then you signed to her, and she started to come back." Maya's hands trembled as she picked up the bracelet. Daniel reached across the table, his fingers lightly brushing hers. "I don't know how this is going to end," he said, "but I needed you to know what you've done for us. You gave us hope." Maya blinked rapidly, nodded, and then signed, "You're not alone." But he was. He knew it. Soon, he would have to fight for Sophie all over again, and this time, he knew it would get ugly. Elena's lawyers were ruthless. Her money and her charm were dangerous weapons. As much as Maya had given to him and Sophie, he couldn't bear the thought of dragging her into his mess. He had seen what scandal did to people. She was quiet, peaceful, and honest. She had built a good life for herself out of almost nothing. He wouldn't be the storm that destroyed it. That night, back in the motel, Daniel sat at the small table, staring at the court papers. His lawyer had called. The hearing was in 2 weeks. He looked over at Sophie, who was drawing in her sketchbook. She had drawn a picture of the cafe, with Maya standing behind the counter, her hands raised in the middle of a sign. Above her head, Sophie had written the word "safe." Daniel's throat tightened. He would face Elena, but Maya didn't need to know the details. Not yet. The next morning, he brought Sophie to the cafe and smiled as if nothing had changed. He gently fastened the bracelet onto Maya's wrist as she poured his coffee. She smiled, touched the charm, and signed, "Beautiful." He signed back, "So are you." But as she turned to help another customer, Daniel looked away. He would protect her, even if it meant keeping her in the dark, even if it meant walking into that courtroom completely alone. The cafe felt different without them. Maya noticed it right away, how the mornings seemed to drag on, how the air felt heavier without the sight of Sophie's bouncing curls or Daniel's steady presence in the corner booth. Nearly a week had passed since their last visit. She tried to tell herself not to worry. People had their own lives, their own reasons and schedules. But with each passing day, she found herself glancing at the door a dozen times, hoping to see them. Nothing. On Friday, after her shift was over, Maya tucked her sketchbook and a box of colored pencils into her tote bag and caught a bus heading toward the motel. The sky was beginning to fade into a pale dusk when she finally knocked on their room door. For a long moment, there was no sound from within. Then the door creaked open. Daniel stood there, his shirt slightly rumpled, his expression worn but softening the moment he saw her. "Maya," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Hey." She raised a hand in a simple greeting, then held up the art supplies. "I thought Sophie might want to draw." She signed with a small smile. Daniel hesitated for only a second before stepping back to let her in. "Come in," he said. The room inside was dimly lit but tidy. Sophie was curled up in an armchair, her arms wrapped tightly around her stuffed fox. When she saw Maya, her face lit up. She leaped down from the chair and ran forward with her arms wide open. Maya knelt to catch her in a hug. They settled onto the carpet together, and Maya opened the sketchbook, laying out the pencils like a fan of colorful treasures. She pointed to the blank page and then signed, "Let's draw feelings." She drew first a bright sun with a smiling face for happy, then a dark cloud with falling raindrops for sad. Then she handed a pencil to Sophie. The little girl stared at the page, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed into a thin line. Slowly, carefully, she began to draw. She drew a heart first, and then two stick figures. One was tall, with short hair, and the other had long, dark hair tied up in a bun. Both figures were standing right next to the heart. Sophie pointed to the figures, then to Daniel, and then to Maya. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Behind them, Daniel watched silently from the small kitchenette, his shoulders slumped, his hands braced on the counter. Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Maya stood at the sink, quietly rinsing 2 mugs. Daniel came to stand beside her. "She drew a family," he said, his voice quiet. Maya nodded without turning around. "I'm losing her," he added, speaking more to the faucet than to her. "Elena's coming for her. The court hearing is in 3 days. Her lawyers are aggressive. And Sophie, she's just starting to heal. I'm about to rip her world apart all over again." Maya set down the mug, dried her hands, and turned to face him. She didn't sign anything. Instead, she placed one hand gently on his shoulder, her fingers curling slightly, as if to ground him. Her eyes said everything else. "I'm here." He inhaled sharply, a tremor running through his chest. Then a small sound made them both turn. Sophie was standing in the hallway, clutching her drawing. In her other hand was a crumpled piece of paper she had taken from Maya's sketchbook. On it, in shaky, uneven letters, she had written, "I do not want to go. I love Daddy. I love Maya." Then, slowly, she raised her hands and signed the word, "Family." Daniel knelt, reaching for her. He couldn't speak at first. His eyes brimmed with tears and finally spilled over. He pulled her into his arms, pressing a kiss to the top of her head and whispering, "I've got you. I've got you, baby." Maya stood frozen for a second before crouching down beside them. Sophie reached out for her, too, wrapping her small arms around Maya's neck and pulling her into their embrace. For a long moment, the three of them just stayed there, a silent, sacred huddle of overwhelming emotion, tears, love, and light. Later, when Sophie was asleep again, her drawing clutched tightly against her chest, Daniel walked Maya to the door. "She needs to say this in court," he said, his voice steady now, filled with a new purpose. "I need to make them see her, hear her." Maya looked at him, her eyes wide. He managed a tired smile. "Thank you for tonight. You gave her the courage to speak with her hands. I don't know what I would do without that." Maya signed back. "She's brave because she's loved." Daniel nodded slowly. And for the first time since the subpoena had arrived, he believed he might actually have a chance. He just hadn't told Maya yet what was coming next. The courtroom was a cold, sterile space, all steel edges and harsh, unflattering light. Daniel adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, not out of vanity, but as a nervous habit to keep his hands from shaking. Across the aisle sat Elena. She looked flawless in a sleek black dress and blood-red lipstick, her heels clicking with an unnerving confidence on the tiled floor. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture ramrod straight and theatrical. But her eyes were cold, icy, and calculating. She barely glanced in Sophie's direction. The judge, a silver-haired woman with a sharp tone but kind eyes, opened the hearing with the usual formalities. Then the attack began. Elena's attorney, a man with a voice as smooth and polished as glass, stood first. "My client," he began, gesturing toward Elena, "is the biological mother of this child. She has always had the best of intentions, despite being misled, excluded, and alienated by Mr. Whitmore, who has taken the child away from all her social and educational support systems." Daniel didn't flinch. He kept his hand firmly on Sophie's shoulder. When it was her turn to speak, Elena rose with a practiced smoothness. "She needs structure. A real school, real therapy, He's keeping her in some rundown motel, letting her play with crayons instead of learning. She used to speak. Now she only signs. I barely recognize her. Her voice cracked with well-rehearsed emotion. I wake up every night wondering if she's crying for me. Daniel's lawyer started to rise, but Daniel placed a hand on his arm to stop him. He stood himself, calm and steady. I don't have a grand speech, he said. Just one request. He turned to the judge. Let Sophie speak. A murmur went through the courtroom. Elena's attorney objected, citing something about emotional manipulation, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Let the child approach. Daniel knelt beside Sophie, whispered something in her ear, and then guided her toward the front. Maya, who was seated quietly behind them, was caught by surprise when a bailiff turned and gestured for her to come forward. Can you interpret for the child? He asked. Maya's throat tightened. She stood and walked to the front on careful, steady feet. She signed gently to Sophie. Do you want to speak? Sophie looked terrified. Her hands fluttered nervously at her sides. Then, she turned her head and scanned the room. She saw Elena, rigid and unsmiling. Then her eyes found Maya. Maya gave her a small smile, one full of love and encouragement. Sophie stepped forward, took a deep breath, and spoke. Maya, her voice was thin and raspy, barely a whisper, but it was a word. A name. The entire courtroom went silent. Even the judge leaned forward. Daniel's eyes instantly filled with tears. Maya crouched down beside Sophie and signed. Do you want to tell them more? Sophie nodded. She began to sign, slowly and carefully. She's not my home. She's a stranger. I do not feel safe. Maya translated, her own voice steady and clear. Sophie pointed to Daniel. He is my safe. Then she turned to Maya. He helps me talk. I feel loved. I feel seen. The judge raised a hand. Ma'am, please translate word for word. Maya nodded, then repeated exactly what Sophie had signed. I want to stay with my dad. I want to be with Maya, too. That is where I feel like myself. Silence. Then a faint creak from Elena's chair as she shifted, uncomfortable. The judge took a long, deliberate pause. Then she nodded. Sophie, thank you, she said gently. You may return to your seat. Sophie walked back toward her father, who was kneeling with his arms open. She ran into them, and he held her tight, his forehead pressed against hers. Maya stood silently watching them. Then Daniel reached out and took her hand. He turned to her and whispered, You gave her a voice, and you gave me something I never thought I'd have again. She blinked quickly, squeezing his hand in return. After a long deliberation, the judge spoke. In light of the child's wishes, her demonstrated comfort and communication progress under Mr. Whitmore's care, and the lack of a substantial presence from the biological mother prior to this case, I award sole custody to Mr. Daniel Whitmore. A collective gasp came from the gallery. Elena didn't protest. She simply stood, adjusted her coat, and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking on the floor, her face unreadable. She never looked back. Daniel remained in his seat for a moment, his arms wrapped around Sophie, tears streaming freely down his face. Maya stood nearby, still as a statue. Then Sophie looked up, smiled, and signed one simple word, family, and Maya, through the blur in her own vision, signed it right back. The house was small and cheerful, nestled among blooming dogwood trees in a quiet Portland suburb. A white picket fence ran along the front yard, and wind chimes tinkled softly on the porch. Inside, the rooms were filled with light and laughter, speaking of a newfound sense of belonging. Maya stood at the kitchen counter, tying up her dark hair as she packed a tote bag with her teaching supplies, flashcards, hand puppets, and laminated signing charts. Across town, a group of children waited at the community center for their lessons with the gentle woman who understood their world better than anyone. In the living room, Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug, editing a video on a tablet. Daniel sat beside her, offering quiet encouragement. On the screen, Sophie was gracefully signing a poem she had written with Maya's help. Family is the place where hearts are heard. Soft music played beneath her fluid movements. No voice was needed. Her confidence spoke volumes. Maya entered the room just as the video finished. She paused in the doorway, watching them for a moment. Daniel turned, smiled softly, and patted the spot on the couch beside him. They sat together in a long, tender silence, their hands finding each other, their fingers weaving together as if they'd always belonged there. Later that week, Daniel did something he had been avoiding for years. He faced the press, not to boast about his tech company or his wealth, but to talk about his daughter. "My proudest accomplishment," he told them, "is not building an empire. It's learning to listen without sound. My family taught me that." He didn't mention Maya by name, but she was there in every photograph, the quiet woman with gentle eyes, his daughter, clinging happily to her side. One afternoon, as the golden light of late day slanted across the lawn, a car pulled into the driveway. Sophie, who was coloring on the porch, looked up and froze. Elena had come back. She stepped out of the car calmly. There was no makeup, no designer clothing, just a simple cardigan, slacks, and a small paper bag in her hand. Her face, though still drawn, held something softer now, something almost human. Daniel opened the front door, waiting silently. "I'm not here to fight," Elena said quietly. I wanted to say something to Sophie." Inside, Maya had moved to stand beside Sophie, who was clutching her arm, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Sophie signed. "She's here." Maya crouched down and gently signed back. "You can go." "It's okay." Sophie hesitated, then gave a small nod and stepped outside. Elena knelt on the porch as Sophie approached. The little girl waited, silent and poised. Elena's voice trembled slightly. "I don't know if you'll understand this yet," she began, "but I need to say it. I left you because I thought I wasn't enough. I thought you didn't need me. I was jealous because you had grown so strong without me." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "But I see now, you didn't need a perfect mother. You just needed love, and I didn't give it to you from the bag." She pulled out an old photograph of herself and Sophie, taken before everything had fallen apart. Sophie stared at it for a long moment. Then she signed, "Thank you for coming back to say that." Elena looked up, tears now slipping silently down her cheeks. Her gaze found Maya, who was standing just inside the doorway, her expression calm and compassionate. Elena's voice steadied. "Thank you," she said, "for loving her, for raising her when I couldn't. I hope you and Daniel find the happiness I couldn't give." "You deserve it." Maya said nothing, but her silence held a profound kindness. She nodded slowly, offering the only gift she could: forgiveness. Elena stood, her shoulders seeming lighter than before, and drove away without looking back. A few days later, the three of them went to the park, the very same place where Maya had once drawn faces in the dirt and taught Sophie her first signs. Daniel tossed a ball to Sophie beneath a canopy of green trees, her laughter echoing across the grass. Maya sat on a nearby bench, a book open but forgotten in her lap. Sophie suddenly broke away from the game and ran toward her. "Mama," she called out, her voice clear and bright. Maya looked up, startled, a wave of pure joy washing over her face as Sophie threw herself into her arms. Daniel joined them moments later, wrapping them both in a long, grateful hug. In that perfect moment, no words were needed. Love had spoken. The most beautiful language doesn't require sound. The story whispered. It only needs someone willing to listen with their entire heart. If this tale touched your soul the way it touched ours, please take a moment to reflect. Sometimes the strongest families aren't the ones we are born into, but the ones we create through love, compassion, and quiet courage. And if you believe, as we do, that the most beautiful language is the one spoken from the heart, then you are already part of our family here. Subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all of what truly matters. Your next story might just be the one that changes a life. Until then, keep listening, not just with your ears, but with your soul.